Well, let's talk about what options may follow and what this means for the situation on the ground. We're joined by former NATO Allied Supreme Commander General Wesley Clark, also Arwa Damon, who is with opposition forces in the city of Benghazi, and our own Nick Robertson, who is in Tripoli. First of all, Arwa, we saw the reaction there in Benghazi. This is exactly, clearly what they have been calling for, desperately calling for, increasingly loudly over the last several weeks. What does this mean now on the ground in Benghazi? They had been preparing for a full-on assault by Gaddafi forces. Are they still doing that?
Yeah, Anderson, they most definitely still are, realizing that they're up against a man who is greatly unpredictable, a man whom, as they say, has not hesitated to massacre his own people, a man who just a few hours before that UN resolution had passed had threatened specifically the people of Benghazi, saying that he would show no mercy, saying that he would hunt them down house to house. So they're very aware of what he is capable of. But besides all of that, they are also extremely relieved, because up until the moment that that UN resolution passed, Anderson, this was a group of people who felt as if the international community had abandoned them, had betrayed them, that a massacre at the hands of Gaddafi's forces was imminent. And all of a sudden, when that resolution passed, everything for them has changed. The hope, the relief, the exuberation that we saw there was remarkable. And even if this has come too late, even if it has taken this much time, people are telling us that at least right now, no matter what happens, they know that they're not alone anymore.
Nick Robertson, you have been traveling with Gaddafi forces. You've been out in the field seeing their military. Is a no-fly zone enough in terms of stopping their military advantage and stopping their onward advance toward Benghazi?
Well, I think the language we've seen in the resolution that says there should be A, an immediate ceasefire, and B, that international intervention can take place if civilians are threatened, really does put a threat against Gaddafi's army, as we saw it lined up outside of Ajdabiya, where it still is trying to get to Benghazi. You've got tanks, heavy anti-aircraft batteries, you've got Katyusha rockets, radar-controlled missile systems on the ground there. If they were to open fire on Ajdabiya or even Benghazi now, then by the terms of the resolution, that would mean they could be targeted. So I think on the ground, potentially, if enforced strictly, as it says in the resolution, that could be a game changer on the ground for Gaddafi's forces, Anderson.
General Clark, in terms of military options, what are they?
Well, the first thing you do is, as Nick said, you call for a ceasefire, immediate ceasefire in place. When Gaddafi doesn't agree with that, you put the aircraft overhead. When the first radars light up your aircraft, you take out the radars, you go after the integrated system, you take down the command and control. When that doesn't stop the onward movement, then at this point, of course, whoever is doing the no-fly zone, whether it's NATO, or some people say it can't be NATO, or a coalition of the willing with strong leadership from the Arab League and U.S. NATO aircraft behind it, whoever is running this can't afford to fail at this point. The UN resolution's clear, protect civilians. So at that point, you've got to scale up your military action and take out the force on the ground, the ships at sea, whatever's threatening. And of course, Gaddafi has played the dumbest possible hand by his irrational comments and tweaking the international community and more or less daring them to take action. The international community is very capable of taking action, and as Secretary of State Clinton said today, we're going to have to deal with Gaddafi one way or another. He's just gone too far. He's out of control, and no matter what happens, he's over.
General Clark, you talked about putting putting aircraft over Libya. What about the possibility of using cruise missiles initially to try to take out whether it's troops or radar stations or surface-to-air missiles or anti-aircraft batteries?
You can also use drones. You can use cruise missiles. The cruise missiles that we typically use are for use against fixed targets. They have to be targeted. It takes some time. Maybe you would initially open up with that kind of a strike, but my guess is you would go in with minimal force initially to get Gaddafi to back down, because the best outcome, immediate outcome, is that there's a ceasefire in place and nobody else is hurt. Then you put the diplomats in on the ground and you lever Gaddafi out of position and out of power. If he rejects that, then you've got to use force, and no matter how good we are and no matter how overextended the Libyans are, when you use force, it's messy and innocent people get hurt.
How quickly, what kind of a timeline do you anticipate? We understand that President Obama has already spoken to the French president and also to the leader of Britain about further action. Obviously, we've heard very strong statements from France's president over the last several days. What kind of a timeline are you looking at, General Clark?
Well, of course, I'm not inside the military operation at this point. If I were, I couldn't disclose it. But what I think you've got two choices. One is you can put the aircraft up immediately, let Gaddafi challenge him, and then take down his system. You might do that tomorrow. Or you give it at least the early hours tomorrow to work the communications there, try to persuade Gaddafi not to move forces, freeze in place, do nothing, in which case you keep the threat of the airstrikes over his head, and you use that as leverage for diplomacy. I think whoever's leading the operation has to sift through those options now and make those decisions right now.
Nick, from what you've seen of Gaddafi's military up close, how organized and effective a fighting force is it?
I think this is a relatively sophisticated fighting force. It's got relatively sophisticated weaponry. It lines up its military hardware and operations in the battlefield pretty much as you'd expect from a sophisticated military. You have, as we saw yesterday, driving up towards the front lines there, you have a couple of miles of ammunition trucks ready to resupply. Then you have a break in the resupply line. Then you have about a half a mile of fuel trucks lined up there. Then another break. Then you have the trucks for water for the troops. And then further on, you have the food for the troops, as well as all the armaments arrayed through the battlefield. So I think this is a fairly professionally equipped army. Does it operate fully under the command and control you get in a Western army? I didn't get that sense. There's sort of ill-disciplined shooting in the air of even heavy weapons, and there's a partly this force is a volunteer force. Interestingly, when asked the foreign minister this evening, the deputy foreign minister, if the government would adhere to that ceasefire, he said, well, that's going to take some time to negotiate. We don't know who we're going to negotiate it with, who the interlocutors are. So you got this real sense from him that the government's trying to play for a little bit of time here. It may want to still continue some of this battle in the field. That seemed to be the implication of this type of language, Anderson.
Arwa, in terms of the opposition forces, clearly we've seen how kind of disorganized they have been. They made early advances, but were beaten back. We see them firing in the air constantly. They're not digging trenches out in the field. It does, you know, it's obviously a military. It's not even a military. It's just opposition forces, people who are civilians who have now taken up arms. How possible is it for them to make the most of this and advance effectively?
You know, Anderson, at this point it would be very difficult for the opposition to actually try to advance on Gaddafi's troops because of everything that you pointed out. They do not have the military expertise, they do not have the military weapons to be able to take on the full force of Gaddafi's military, which is what he has thrown at them right now. The best that they can do in this scenario, while we are perhaps waiting for this no-fly zone to be implemented, for other measures to be taken, is to hold the ground that they actually have. And that is, of course, assuming that Gaddafi does not decide to overnight or in the early hours of the morning launch some sort of revenge, intense air and artillery bombardment, perhaps not just targeting Ashdabia. Of course, the concern is that he is then going to move on and target Benghazi. Prior to this UN resolution taking place, the opposition had said that they were going to try to mass together, try to go down to Ashdabia, at least try to keep Gaddafi's forces from moving on to Benghazi. But the reality at the end of the day is that without these no-fly zones being implemented, without some sort of outside force bringing in its air capabilities, the opposition at best can perhaps hold on to the ground that it has, but advance on Gaddafi's forces, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. General Clark, very briefly, do you worry that this escalates beyond what some in America who support it think is possible? I mean, is this a slippery slope that suddenly, you know, we can't take out Gaddafi by the air, these forces on the ground can't really make advancements, and then you suddenly found yourselves much more deeply involved than the U.S. had anticipated?
I think that's absolutely what would happen if we're not successful in stopping it right here. And so, to go back to what Nick said, you cannot allow Gaddafi's people to stall for 2 days while he continues his offensive. This has to draw a line, have to stop this very quickly. Otherwise, it will drag on. And once you engage in an operation like this, whether you're the United Nations or a coalition of the willing, you can't fail against a state like Libya, led by Gaddafi. You have to succeed. So yes, it's the start of a slippery slope. So when we go in, we have to know what the objective is and use decisive force as early as possible.
Moving fast. Events are moving fast on the ground on multiple fronts. General Clark, appreciate it. Nick Robertson, stay safe. Arwa Damon, stay safe in the days ahead.